did want to take this opportunity to share some work that I'm doing right now with several colleagues to process some interviews that we did back in 2017, actually, chairside, with patients on hemodialysis at 3 different Northwest Kidney Centers units. And, I'm honestly a little intimidated today to talk to an audience of nephrologists about the experience of dialysis and patients' experiences of dialysis. It's intimidating because, of course, many of you are extremely familiar with dialysis, and you've had many patients that you've cared for doing dialysis, and you probably actually know a lot of what I'm going to talk about. But, I do think there's value from seeing things from slightly different angles. I heard this reference to this. Apparently, this is sort of a trope in business, in the business world, the pig and chicken analogy, which I actually heard on an interview. I was listening in on an interview a colleague was doing with somebody on dialysis, and they made a reference to this pig and chicken analogy. So I had to go look it up on the internet. But basically, you'll see it here. They're talking about opening a breakfast restaurant, and suddenly, I'm going to call it ham and eggs, and suddenly the pig is like, wait a minute, no thanks, I'd be committed, but you'd only be involved, right? So the point here is that, yes, we take care of people on dialysis, but I'd venture to say probably none of us on this call, as far as I know, I shouldn't make assumptions, but most of us, let's say, have not experienced dialysis ourselves. And so sometimes you can learn a lot by studying what seems familiar, but from a different angle. And so I'm just going to move I hope you can see this. This is actually part of a photo series I put into Google, making the invisible visible. And this is one of the photos that came up. But I think, this is the reason many of us do research, actually, I think, is to learn something we don't know, to see something from a different angle. So the work that we did was I did with my colleague here, Janelle Taylor, who is an anthropologist, was at the University of Washington, is now at the University of Toronto. She is a friend, mentor, colleague, overall really amazing person, who always brings something to whatever she's doing. She always brings something. And so I had the privilege of sitting with her and interviewing patients who were getting dialysis. They were patients who were enrolled in a larger study we did that was a survey related to end-of-life care. And we selected some of these patients to interview, and we came up with an interview guide, which was actually very general. Medicine, often we go in with sort of an agenda and a sort of a script as what we want to hear. And we really tried very hard not to do that here, very open-ended. So we wanted to hear about people's story, how they wound up on dialysis, what their experience was like. We wanted to hear about the people who support them. We wanted to hear about their interactions with nephrologists and other patients. One of our main goals in the study was actually also to understand their experience of planning for the future, planning for serious illness. And we also asked them, if they could see if there are any silver linings for them in terms of their experience of dialysis and whether they had advice to others. And we did a total of 17 interviews, which Janelle and I have been in some state of reviewing and going back to for some years now, but recently I've been going through the transcripts for this closely, and we're hoping to write a chapter. But basically, it was sort of a convenient sample of 17 people who were interviewed, who were surveyed, who agreed to participate in an open-ended interview. And Janelle and I sat chairside and talked with these folks. And Everybody but one agreed to be recorded, and they lasted about an hour, and we would do 1 or 2 interviews in a given day. We would usually do this 1 day a week, and we would usually go for lunch afterward and kind of talk about, kind of debrief really, and talk about what we had noticed, and then we made some notes, and then we got the interviews transcribed. We had the recordings. Patients got some compensation, obviously, for their work. And what I want to spend the rest of the time doing is just kind of telling you a little bit about what we heard. As I say, this is actually kind of preliminary. This could change as we write this up and continue to analyze, but this is sort of what's kind of popping out right now. Three major themes. One, and I'll go through each of these in detail, but this sense of, when people told us about how they wound up on dialysis, a sense of disruption. And then in talking about their life on dialysis, it's almost like a sort of a constricted kind of existence. As I was thinking through these interviews, probably the younger members of the audience may not be familiar with this, but "Welcome to the Machine" is a Pink Floyd song that you may or may not be familiar with. But this song just kept playing in my mind, so hence the somewhat obscure reference here. And then finding how do people find a path forward. So this is sort of the general categories, and really the rest of the talk, I'm just going to pull some of the quotes. Depending on how quickly I get through this, I may have to skip some quotes just to make sure I kind of get through everything in the time available. But the first is disruption, and I would say disruption's a word you see used a lot in the business world. It's usually felt to be a good thing, but for the most part, this was not experienced as the good kind of disruption. Without exception, everybody that we spoke with saw their kidney disease and being on dialysis. This was really truly an existential threat for everybody. And, there were a range of ways that, as you can imagine, that people wound up on dialysis, ranging from the sort of life-threatening, near-death experience that, one patient I remember had basically had a 3-hour nosebleed in his bathroom and was found by his 6-year-old son and taken, to the hospital and started emergently on dialysis after many months of trying to sort of put things off. But I would say the most of the people we talked with, it was actually more of a sort of routine. Well, your labs are getting worse, it's time to start dialysis. So regardless of what sort of precipitated dialysis, everybody we talked with really saw it as not a choice if they wanted to continue living. This is just an example from one of the people we spoke with, but I could probably pick this out from everybody's interview. I had no choice if I wanted to live. So truly sort of life and death. A lot of loss. I found this a particularly heartrending. This 61-year-old Black, self-identified Black male who had a very limited life even before starting dialysis. He was working night shift at Safeway, and he was trying to go to school at a community college. He had actually been on dialysis a long time when we spoke with him. And before he started dialysis, his recreation would be he would take the train down to Portland to visit his cousins, and the bulk of his family was down there, and then he'd kind of come back just in time for his shift at Safeway. And when he started dialysis, he couldn't work anymore. He wanted to keep working, but he couldn't, and he had to drop out of school. And I will say in our notes, Janelle had noted that he of all the people we talked with seemed particularly grateful for the $25 gift certificate. That is to say, we talk to people, across the spectrum in terms of social needs, socioeconomic status, if you like. At the other end, there was still loss, right? So this 86-year-old white male talked about how he and his wife used to have a condo down in Palm Desert. We had some really good times down there, a lot of friends, they were very active, and those days are all gone now. And some of it was dialysis, some of it was his other health issues. Shattered dreams, and this was a very, heartbreaking. This 46-year-old Black man had actually been a power lifter, and he was up for some, actually awards. He was training and really trying not to go on dialysis for that reason, and eventually had to go on dialysis, got very sick, and tried to keep powerlifting, but eventually he just couldn't do it. And as he put it, kidney disease derailed my shot at some records, at some awards he was going to win. I had to slow down. I was sick, couldn't do it because somebody had to help him off from the stage where he was lifting. A lot of what we heard was disruptions to work, and in our society, productivity, economic productivity and work are highly valued, right? We live in a society where that's very valued. And so, not only were there people who had to work, but there were people also who wanted to work. So, and had plans for their retirement. And so this was a 74-year-old Chinese male, and he actually was still working, but he had two jobs that he really enjoyed. And he actually was a bartender in a major hotel chain, and he had all these, that was his second job, and he had all these plans where he was going to travel because he had free hotel stays at, I think it was the Westin hotels, that he could travel for and stay in places for very low cost. And so he was really looking forward to that. When I retire, I'm going to travel because I saved up enough money to go. So this just really put a crimp in where I can go and things I can do. And he really liked food and eating, and and that's why he liked travel. So the dietary restrictions also were, kind of put a damper on things. And then, people also experienced, changes in their role, work being the biggest one. And of course, many of us take our identity from our works, very important in our society in terms of who we are, how we see ourselves. But yeah, so very hard for people when they could no longer do the things they used to do. This was same gentleman actually talked about how his son had to come over and help with sort of household tasks because he used to do those. And he said it's very, very hard to shut it off. And this was a sort of a different situation, but a 57-year-old Asian man who, as he was staying home more, he was originally doing peritoneal dialysis. He actually took over a lot of his wife's roles and et cetera. And she goes, he goes, I'm the semi-mother and she's a semi-father, my wife. Just the point being, not necessarily saying that these are bad things. It's more that roles are shifting. The really heartbreaking thing actually was that people did really carry a lot of sense of responsibility for what had happened to them, with them. So this is actually the man we just spoke, I just mentioned. He had been actually a pastry chef, and he goes, he blamed his kidney disease on not being able to control his diabetes. Plus I'm a pastry cook, the temptation, I love chocolate, especially with nuts, and, just to think that of course we know disease very complex, probably not single cause like that, but so a lot of disruption to people, people's lives. And then arrive at dialysis, and suddenly things are still struggling for the right terms here, so this will probably change, but very sort of constricted. Starters, very time consuming, and this patient, I thought, put it very well. He was self-employed, and the time on dialysis actually really interfered with his ability to work. And so he goes, I think the biggest cost was surrendering that time. So it's very time consuming, and we all know this, right? lot of suffering, both psychological. So this older white woman described how she was literally scared to death when she first got on the machine, where she had to pay her caregivers to actually be there with her, but also the physical discomfort. And this gentleman talked about, if it's not a cramp, it's itching. There are times where I get cramps, painful. I feel so weak. I feel like a wilted vegetable. It's hard, and I think to most of us will be quite familiar with those kinds of concerns. But this I wasn't quite as attuned to, is there's the sort of individual suffering, but there's also this communal suffering. And so this woman who described herself as a Hispanic woman who identified as mixed Filipino, Irish, and Blackfoot, she described this idea that when you hear somebody coding or cramping, it's like a sympathetic pregnancy because you felt it too, and that was stressful. So the sort of collective suffering as well. And my God, punishing. I mean, very little margin, for not complying, as it were, with the treatment. And I just thought this was just so poignant. This patient described, my weakness is water, for God's sakes, right? My weakness is water. But this is a very real concern, and so when we tell our patients to drink less and restrict fluid, think about that. That is, this is the most basic thing, right? Thirst. And so not much margin, and very inflexible. And none of this is really to blame anyone in particular, but dialysis facilities are not the most flexible of institutions, if you like. And this patient actually described his work was very important to him. He was in construction, and he really wanted to get back to it. And eventually he was able to get back, and we asked him, how long did that take? And he said, I think a year, because I keep waiting for my time they put me earlier. They have a hard time scheduling. So basically, they eventually, after he sort of, kept at it, they did reschedule him and he was able to work. And, again, we understand why this is difficult, but when you're the individual, it's, pretty inflexible. People were felt very less, not that they came out and said that, but, this quote from a patient describing their interactions, there were a lot of discussion about dry weight and volume removal. And so this patient relates a conversation they had with their nephrologist, and who came in and said, I think you're going to have your dry weight lowered. How do you feel about that? And I'm like, the patient's like, I don't want it lowered, but he lowered it anyway. And so I understand that, but I don't like it, and so it's sort of this kind of negotiation, but they're not clearly the ones with the power there. And this is the patient I described earlier who would take the Skyliner train to Portland. He said, when we asked him about his relationship to the nephrologist, he said, you get along really well if you do what they ask, which I thought was a pretty interesting insight. This was probably the most striking thing that I learned, at least listening to these interviews, and it's been a little hard to articulate, but I would say we heard this from almost everybody, is how limited those ties are with other patients, right? They're coming there 3 times a week. They're there for 3-4 hours. There's a whole bunch of people on the shift. They're cohorted. But actually, this was very common, that these relationships, and not to say they're not important, because actually it turns out ties actually probably are fairly important for our mental health. But this was very common. This patient, we asked patients about their relationship to other patients, and we asked if they'd gotten to know other patients. Not really. There are a couple here I speak to and smile, but I would not consider them anywhere near in the support category. And we heard different ways people express this, but yes, fairly superficial relationships with other patients, limited opportunities for interaction. And go into more detail on that, but that was one of the major learning points here. This was very heartbreaking. You know, this patient described how one of the nurses passed away that she had become quite close with. And in contrast with patients, their relationships to patients, the patients often describe quite close relationships with nursing staff in particular. And this nurse had died and no one told the patient. She didn't find out for a week later. And she found out when someone was putting her on, and she burst out, you know, I was bawling. I went to school with her and all her cousins, and it was like, you didn't tell us. And I mean, this is really getting at the intersectional identity piece, right? Because you're not just a patient, you're a person with a life. And so where do we draw those boundaries? And that can be an unintentional source of suffering for patients when the boundaries are drawn in a way where they don't feel supported as a person. And you know, the descriptions of interactions with nephrologists, there were some positive, but a lot of it made it sound like it was pretty transactional. This patient described their interactions with a nephrologist. We go through the lab results and stuff like that from the kidney center and stuff, you know, very sort of numbers driven. And there was almost like a quality of sameness when we asked kind of medical type questions, like we asked about advanced care planning, and we got almost the same answer from every single patient we talked with, you know, which was, if I'm a vegetable, if I have no quality of life, vegetable was a very common term people use, then let me go. And that was sort of the end of, it was actually very hard. And so I haven't quite processed this, but that was it was a big conversation stopper. Janelle wanted to title it The Vegetable Horizon, because it was really like not something people really wanted to talk about. So I have about 5 minutes, and I'm just gonna, apologies that it's a little rushed, but I'm gonna talk about what I think of as kind of the meat of this is how did people find a path forward? And I just want to say that, you know, this is to me the most interesting part. And I think when we're caring for patients, if there's one message I have to you, it's like, take the time to learn about how they're finding their path, because that's where you're going to see the individuality shine through. So finding path, a lot of it was about acceptance. And this is a very common theme, like it's keeping me alive. I have no choice. I'm resigned to it. And this, you know, we had several people talk about how to do the dialysis. They had to psych themselves up and they had to play their music really loud or different things, and accept it. So it's almost like this sort of gritting of the teeth. You know, also, and this kind of reminds me of Mo's experience a little bit, was people sometimes had to set limits on what they would and wouldn't tolerate. And sometimes the only way they could do that was voting with their feet. And so this is an example of a patient who'd had a bad experience with a technician who, first of all, was not very good at sticking. So there was a lot of pain, but also not respectful and not attentive. And basically put the foot down and said, I'm not, you know, if she's working in my pod, I'm leaving. And they talked about how all the patients actually talked about this on the bus on the way home, and they all kind of felt the same way, but there wasn't really much space for them to really bring that up. The only way they could do it was to, you know, really just say, I'm setting my limits here. And there were all other kinds of ways that people set limits. Fascinating, this patient described how he actually was very engaged with his treatment. So he was very focused on the fluid removal and how he'd sort of watch his cramps. And then as soon as they came on, he'd say, hey, you know, to the tech, put me on the minimum. And if it continues, then I'll say, give me some saline, you know. And he was not of a medical background. And I was curious, you know, I asked him, did you get any pushback? No, you know, so that was interesting. Some people, you know, found a way to actually have control over their treatment. So there were all kinds of ways that people sort of exerted control. Some people compartmentalize their time on dialysis. They actually didn't really want to mix very much with other patients. You know, we're not watching the game together. You know, I need to maintain that as separate. So that was interesting. This patient really like talked about how, you know, he didn't want to take access bus or anything. He wanted to drive himself to dialysis because it's like he saw that as freedom. And he makes this, when I read this, I was like, oh my God, that is so profound. I had not heard it when we were interviewing him, but he goes, as the box shrinks, everything starts to count. You know, because I'm not riding in no short buses. It's not going to happen. So again, you know, what are the things that are mattering to people? It's going to be different in every case, but this really forces, you know, people to decide. And then, you know, sometimes relationships with providers could also be very important. This woman talked about how important her nephrologist had been in terms of helping her, what she said, you know, set the tone for how she was going to survive. Occasionally, you know, people had these sort of moments of enlightenment where this actually one patient started questioning his religious beliefs, mainly because he started reading the Bible on dialysis, and then he realized how mean and, you know, he was just very turned off by Christianity. So it actually, he said he was kind of woke up, you know, he changed his faith. Others, you know, that this guy kind of started to value time, you know. So for some people, it was definitely some enlightenment. Universal, I would say almost everyone we talked with, they used humor. Deal with the situations. This is just one example of that. You know, he'd asked for a horse kidney, and I can become strong, and, you know, Winnie's like a horse. So it's kind of cool. But I think the key message here is everybody's a bit different, and that's really interesting. I actually disagree with the patient here. It shouldn't be difficult. It's like that. That's what's interesting. It's very restricted existence, but people find ways to get by, and how they do that is really, it's interesting. So I am right at 9:30, so I'm going to just cut this very short. I just do want to take a few minutes to say that I have learned a lot, obviously, by taking care of patients, interviewing these patients, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. Bill Peckham, who many of the, you know, newer additions to our division did not have the opportunity to know Bill, but Bill was a patient who lived almost his entire adult life on dialysis or some form of dialysis. He was doing home dialysis and died in 2019, sadly. He was very generous with his time, and he was I like to say, he was a patient advocate before patient advocacy was fashionable. And I learned so much from him in talking about his experiences. It really sensitized me to the patient perspective. In terms of, you know, literature, if you haven't read it, Ordinary Medicine by Sharon Kaufman, an anthropologist at UCSF, talks about technology, and she talks a lot about dialysis and how that has changed our lives, and, you know, raises a lot of sort of moral and ethical questions for people. And then this paper, this book, Disrupted Lives, which Janelle actually clued me into when we started talking about the themes, but this is actually by Gay Becker, who's another UCSF anthropologist. She and Sharon were friends and close colleagues, and did a lot of work around chronic illness and aging, and how people, you know, how the disruption, seeing those as disruptions to life, which can in and of itself be a source of stress. So just, you know, I think it's good for us to, as we're taking care of patients, to remember that our perspective is not exactly the same as theirs, and try to be appreciative and curious about their experience. I also just want to add, in addition to Janelle and the patients, that Kate has kindly offered to help with this analysis. So this will get much better in the coming months. So she's going to be working with Janelle and I to sort of kind of refine this some, and then we're going to have a chance to, I hope, contribute to a chapter on the patient experience in the USRDS report this year through Kirsten Johansson and James Wetmore. I hope it'll be a first, because that is a very quantitative report. Anyway, I apologize for taking a few extra minutes of your time, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Dr. O'Hare. Of course, I'm looking forward to working on that project. And it just reminds me, among other things specific to this project, how much of a pleasure it is to have a chance doing these qualitative interviews to actually just sit down and talk to people and have that not having an agenda, as you say, which I think a lot of us would like to do more, have more opportunity for in clinical medicine, but obviously constrained in many ways. Dr. Mehrotra, we have maybe just a few minutes for questions for those who can stay on for a few minutes. Thank you.
Just a quick comment, and thank you for that very provocative talk. I endorse giving patient a choice in their treatment decisions, and I don't want to lose this opportunity that it needs to be one step before in also giving them a choice in what type of dialysis they choose. And as I often say, the wheels of our healthcare system are greased to get person into a hemodialysis chair. There are alternatives to in-center hemodialysis that our patients deserve to be aware of. Susan works in conservative care. I've advocated for home dialysis, and it needs to be a full menu of options that patients need to choose from. Thank you for what you presented.
No argument there, Roger. It's a very good point.
Dr. Rivaro?
Yeah, thanks, Anne, for that talk, and really for those quotes from patients, which are so meaningful. And it was actually Raj who, in many of his talks, has made the following statement, which I think has just been so true, which is that there's no other treatment in medicine for which we ask so much of patients so many days per week for so many months and years of their life, and spending time to understand that lived experience, I do think makes us better physicians and better able to care for them. Although, as you've said, it really is impossible to fully appreciate that for those of us who've never been on dialysis. But thanks so much for this work.
Thank you, Matt. Totally agree. Thank you. Really appreciate everyone's attention, and wish everybody a wonderful summer. I guess this is our last grand rounds.
Yeah, thank you, Anne.